This
Uh,
conference will now be recorded.
okay. Good evening, everyone. I first would like to express my appreciation to Dennis and Kim and Anna for making the program possible. This program was originally designed to be shown only to historical societies and Civil War clubs. I didn't think there'd be that much of an interest in it on the part of the general public because it does show some very, very depressing photographs of dead American Civil War soldiers. However, some libraries found out about it and they wanted to see it and they showed it. And to my astonishment, it became one of my most popular programs. But keep in mind that it does show some disturbing figures. So when you watch the program, please keep that in mind. The In April 1861, when the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter, they unleashed hell in this country. It was the worst catastrophe this country had ever seen then. And men willingly went off to war thinking it was going to be one very big, glorious adventure. And in a way, in some instances, people were glad to go to war. They had no idea what to expect. And they thought it'd be glorious and fun, and they'd be parading around in all these beautiful uniforms, and the girls would be impressed. It was the same attitude, part of the culture on both sides, both the Union and the Confederates. Each side naively thought that they could defeat the other side with no trouble at all. They had absolutely no concept of what to expect until the reality of the war finally set in. And this is what it was the sheer horror of the war and its enormous casualties and photographs of the carnage that shocked the public. Photographs and images of the battles and these dead soldiers were shown in all the major cities in the country, and the people were absolutely stunned. Nobody had expected anything quite like this. In order to appreciate the what had happened and the attitude at the time, you have to look at the culture at the time, the mortality culture, because life was very different then, and in fact, death was a part of the everyday experience. With medical care in its infancy, people accepted mortality and crippling disease as part of everyday life. They were totally unprepared for a war which killed massive numbers of young, healthy men. If you go to a cemetery, I'm sure all of you have seen them in churches, cemeteries that go back to the 1800s. One of the things you notice is how many children died in that era. Infants, teenagers, whatever. They couldn't control it because of the medicine basically was in a primitive stage. But however, people were religious then as now, maybe more so then to a certain extent. And Christian and religious values did provide some emotional relief to those who believed that deceased loved ones would share eternity with God and with Jesus. They didn't understand what depression was like. They was referred to that as melancholia, where people would be upset about things, but they didn't understand it because psychology or psychiatry at that point didn't exist. It didn't come till later on. So they had to deal with these things as best they could. The 19th century mortality rate was horrendous. In 1950, life expectancy for white males was only about 38 years. I don't know what it was for African Americans. I was just able to get the figures on white people. I'm sure for blacks was much lower than that. In 2011, the life expectancy for white males was 80 years of age, which scares the hell out of me because I'm 84 now. But that's pretty much the way it was, and people had to accept it, though they didn't like it. In the antebellum era, the infant mortality rate was 20%. Nowadays, it's about 77%. And even that is probably governed by different demographic groups. The photograph that you see over here is a very sad photograph because it's not what it appears to be. The child is dead. And it was the custom that era for people when families lost very young children, infants, which happened a lot, or young children, teenagers, they photographed a dead child. And I saw photographs and doing research of this program, 4, 5, and 6 children. Everybody's dressed in their Sunday best. And in the center is the dead child, and the eyes are open to make it look alive. Now, why did they do this? They weren't ghoulish. Basically, they didn't know how to deal with the depression that they had to deal with the loss of a child. They wanted a memory of the child, and this was the only way they can do it. And this is the way this woman would best remember her child while it was still there. So she'd have a photograph to cherish for the rest of her life. The population in 1861 was about 35 million. In the North, it was 22. In the South, 9 million whites and the 4 million blacks were, of course, slaves. The difference is this, that here in the North, the population was growing faster because that's where the jobs were. The North was heavily industrialized and the South was not, which means the immigrants coming in from Europe, from Ireland, Germany, England, wherever, it was much easier for them to get a job in the North than it was for them to get a job in the South. Now, why did I mention those figures? Because approximately 750,000 men were killed in the American Civil War. But oddly enough, it was only 1/3 were from actual battle wounds. 2/3 died from disease. And what was killing them was things like gangrene if they were wounded. They had measles, pneumonia, strep throat infections, and trench mouth. This is a point of information. When I was in the service, I was getting a strep infection an average of once every 6 weeks. All I did was I went to the hospital. They gave me a shot of infection and they cleared it up within 3 or 4 days. The same thing with trench mouth. That was a gum infection, which can lead to heart disease and cardiac arrest. However, these days it's easily treatable with penicillin or some other antibiotic. They didn't have that then. If they got it, they had to hope that they got through it. There was nothing they could take for it. Consequently, you can see why they were dying. Venereal disease also is prevalent because you had camp followers, you had prostitutes following all the armies wherever they went, and they, of course, many of them were sick, and the men caught the disease, and they could die from that. Okay, there was also archaic military strategy. The American Civil War was pretty well fought the same way the Napoleonic Wars were fought in the 1800s. All right, they had large masses of men grouped together, and the other side would fire at them. The other side, both sides are using smoothbore rifles, which are only accurate to within 50 to 75 yards. This tactic produced horrific losses in the Civil War due to rifle muskets that were accurate to within 500 yards. So what I'm saying here is that the technology of warfare had changed. But this was the typical rifle that was used by the Civil War soldier. This was a Springfield. We also were buying a lot of Enfield rifles from England, which are virtually identical. In fact, the parts are interchangeable. You loaded it from the front, you put in black powder, then you put in a round ball, and then you loaded it with this ramrod over here. You can see and then they'd shove it down, they could fire it, and then they had to put a cap inside here, and that would ignite it, and the thing would go off. An experienced Civil War soldier could fire 3 rounds per minute, but whether that actually happened under the stress of combat is I don't know. Now, as long as they could fire those, these guns were very, very accurate, as I mentioned, to within 500 yards. If you put a scope on them, they could maybe be accurate even beyond that. But then in the middle of the war, these guns came out. This was a Henry rifle, later on known as Winchester, and I believe they carried 16 and maybe it was 17 rounds. You could shoot this gun all day. The Confederates had nothing like this. And this was the Spencer rifle. They came out, I think, around 1863. It took 7 rounds through the front. These were regular bullets. You didn't have to bother with black powder or paper or what they call mini balls. They were deadly. And the Confederates had nothing. Now, of course, they could pick them off the battlefield if they won the battle. However, the South wasn't manufacturing ammunition for this in any way, so they virtually weren't that useful to the South. Now, you may ask, why did the North keep on using this thing? Well, because it was cheap. For that era, it was $19. These guns cost $35 a piece. An individual soldier could buy his own rifle if he wanted to. If you were a private and you wanted a Henry rifle or Spencer, you could buy one if you had the $35, but you had to provide your own ammunition. In addition to that, as mentioned earlier, there was no time for precise surgery. There's no antibiotics. It was much easier just to amputate. 75% of all amputations were successful. Now, at Gettysburg, both sides lost approximately 25,000 men, which is killed, captured, or wounded. Now, this is what a hospital would look like, a field hospital. Now, you can imagine what it was like after 3 days of bloody fighting at Gettysburg. You have 20, you have all these thousands and thousands of casualties, and they're all lined up with this waiting to be treated. And there's no antibiotics to help them. So, also lack of camp hygiene. Surgical instruments were not disinfected, they were just washed off in water. Blood transfusion was in its infancy. Not too many people got a transfusion. Wounded soldiers were treated last, if at all. The winning side wasn't interested in the enemy. The burial procedures were primitive, but it also depended upon who had won the battle. In this case, the Union, I don't recall now which battlefield this is, but this is typical. If the Union won the battle, they would take all the Confederate bodies, just dump them in these ditches, and then cover it up in these trenches. Now, what would happen is that these bodies were not identified. All they would know is that later on, when relatives came and exhumed them, that this was maybe the 35th Alabama or the 10th Georgia. That's all they would know because they had fought in this particular battle. But they wouldn't know who the individuals were. It was different with the winning side. The winning side had time to bury their dead properly. So here's the Union side. The bodies are covered with blankets, and they have markers over as to their name, their rank, and what unit they were in. Later on, when these bodies were exhumed, they know exactly who they were. But some of them they didn't. Over here, these may be totally unidentified. And here's more Confederate dead at Antietam. Again, they were just thrown into a trench, covered over, and forgotten about. So basically, the winning side, whoever controlled the field, had buried their dead with respect, but enemy soldiers were displaced with little attempt to identify them. In some cases, there were markers identifying the dead, but that didn't always happen. This is, for those of you familiar with the war, you know that Little Round Top was a major battle, which the Confederates tried to take this hill. They weren't able to do it. The Union Army prevailed. You had a large number of dead at the bottom of the hill, and all they did was, this is July 2nd, 1863, the Confederate dead simply were covered with branches and stones and maybe a little bit of soil, and some were buried with their heads and hands exposed, making them prey for animals and birds. I read that for a full year after the Battle of Gettysburg, from 1863 to 1864, the people of Gettysburg would not eat pork because they were afraid if the hogs had gotten out, they would have devoured the bodies. In the Second Battle of Fredericksburg in May 1863, you can see this is an illustration of how what they call the civilian aid societies contributed coffins so they could bury the Union dead properly. And this is another example of the differences in how the sides treated the enemy. This is a Union soldier. This is Antietam, where the Union controlled the battlefield afterwards. They treated their own set with respect, properly buried. There's the head marker, and here's a Confederate soldier just left there. So you say, well, what happened to it? Well, whoever owned that property, maybe a week later, would come by after the army had left, and they'd have to bury the body someplace, but they probably wouldn't even mark it. They'd just throw it in the ground and forget about it. That's what was done. It was totally disrespectful. This all changed after the war, and I'll explain how. And you say, how come there were so many unidentified? 50% of all Civil War soldiers dead were not identified because they weren't using dog tags in those days. They weren't military issue. However, you could buy one on your own from one of the merchants which followed the armies. You could buy this in town so that people would know who you are. At Gettysburg, over 3,100 Union soldiers were buried in trenches by July 11th because it was hot out. It was a very hot summer, and they had to get the bodies underground as quickly as possible. Wherever possible, the dead were identified, but a few months later, the bodies were exhumed and reburied at the Gettysburg National Cemetery, where Lincoln gave his favorite address. Now, what about the Confederates that died there? As mentioned, they at least suffered 25,000 casualties. Almost 4,000 Confederates were buried in the trench with little attempt to identify them other than by unit. In 1871, they were disinterred and they were buried in Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia. In fact, there's 18,000 Confederates buried there, not just from Gettysburg, but from other battles which took place. A word about Elizabeth Thorne. Elizabeth and her husband were German immigrants, and they went to work at the Gettysburg Civilian Cemetery. This is well before the national one had been set up for the soldiers. Her husband was a volunteer in the Union Army. He was all fighting. She was in her 6 month of pregnancy. Her staff ran off. And what she did was she took the shovel. And if you see a side view of the statue of Elizabeth, you see she has an extended stomach. She was in her 6 month of pregnancy. It was a hot summer day in July and August, and she dug the bodies of 91 soldiers and 14 civilians in her 6 month of pregnancy. She had, and 3 months later, she gave birth to a girl, and the child was never right. Her daughter died at the age of 14, and Elizabeth claimed that it was because of the physical and emotional stress she'd been over in those horrible days in July and August. Hospitals also had cemeteries because so many of the soldiers died, and the cemeteries were established close to the hospitals, and some were later converted into national cemeteries. The prisons themselves provided their own unique problems themselves because dead soldiers were buried in trenches with markers identifying them by name. But after the war, wooden stakes were replaced by stone markers. At Anderson National Cemetery, 13,000 soldiers are buried here. This is what it was like to be a prisoner at Andersonville under the Confederates. 28% of the soldiers, 13,000, died of starvation, disease, and lack of medical attention. The Confederate captain in charge of the camp was executed a few months after the war. Now, Camp Douglas, on the other hand, was a Union camp. And over there, 6,000 Confederates died of cold, malnutrition, disease, and lack of medical attention. Now, this doesn't make any sense because while the Confederates were short on food and clothing and blankets, the Union Army certainly was not. They had everything they needed. The Union was never short of anything. They had plenty of food and medical attention. But the Union captain who ran Camp Douglas, had lost his son in the war, and he hated the Confederates with a passion. And as a result, he decided not to take care of them. And as a result, there were 6,000 Confederate losses, which never should have taken place. Never. At Marietta, Georgia, there's 10,000 Union soldiers buried there, 3,000 Confederates. And someone had gotten the idea of burying them together, but then other people said no, that would be disrespectful. Each side wanted their own. As I mentioned, 50% of dead soldiers were never identified. They have no idea who they were. At Shiloh, which was a big win for General Grant, they made sure that American soldiers, Union soldiers, were buried properly. The Confederates were thrown into a trench, and what they did was to give it some degree of respectability. They went and they put up these cannonballs all around it and a marker, which means that when families of the soldiers could come, at least they knew approximately where the loved ones were buried. But they have no idea who they were individually. There was a way of preserving bodies for the shipment home. If you were private, you would pay tribe for $25. Now, how did these embalmers know who you were? What they would do is, if you paid for the service, they'd give you like a marker, like a lapel, so a marker to put on your lapel. Then after the battle was over, these ghoulish men would wander around the battlefield. They look for somebody with a marker on them, so they know they had paid for the service to bring them in. They embalm the bodies and they send them home. Of course, the higher up you went, the more they charged. Okay, this is a sad photograph of a man with his dead son, and some families could go to the battlefield that was close by and bury loved ones or bring them home. There could be a ghastly process of decomposition that set in. All right, men were wounded so badly that they could never work again, and some men would be embarrassed to walk out in public with wounds like this. There was no plastic surgery. In 1862, the federal government purchased land for 12 new cemeteries near battle sites, camps, and hospitals. And pre-war internment in 1867, the government had approved $4 million to a program to rebury the bodies of 303,000 Union cemeteries and soldiers. And in all these in 74 new cemeteries. 30,000 African American soldiers were buried in separate areas of the cemetery designed for color. So even in death, they were segregated. Okay. Now, now the war is over. You have all these Southern men buried in the North and in Tatum, other parts of Maryland, Pennsylvania, and the women in the South decided they wanted to bring the men home. They wanted them with maybe in Richmond or cemeteries, where they could go there and pay their respects. So the reburial of Confederate dead got in. Now, in the North, the federal government was responsible for all this, and they did a very, very fine job in doing it. In the South, it was different because the South had lost the war. So individual states had to do this. This is the reason why so many women volunteered. They wanted to bring their men home. And between 1865 and 1871, Southern women got together from all these states, and at their own expense, with some degree of support from the states, Southern states, they brought 30,000 Confederate soldiers home for reinterment in Southern military and civilian cemeteries. As I mentioned before, his Hallowed Confederate Cemetery in Virginia. Okay. In Oakwood, Tennessee, as I mentioned, 6,000 Confederates had died at Camp Douglas, Chicago. 4,200 were buried right over here in Camp Douglas. The other 1,800 were brought home. Grave sites are still being discovered. There's no end to it. Because sometimes these soldiers would die on the road, and they just buried them there. In 1985, the graves of 19 African American soldiers of the 55th Massachusetts Colored Infantry were discovered in Jolly Beach, and they were reburied with honors at Beaufort National Cemetery. The Confederates had come up with a submarine that was kind of unique. It certainly changed naval warfare. The submarine really wasn't very good. It was operated strictly by hand, and it did succeed in shipping and sinking one Northern ship, one Union ship, but then it sank itself, and then it was discovered sometime around the year 2000. And when they brought it up, the bodies were still there. So what they did was they had these reenactors, 6,000 reenactors. They took these bodies and they gave them a Confederate funeral in the Confederate cemetery. 4,000 women showed up. They take this very seriously in the South. It's not like here, even though we do have reenactors. But 4,000 women showed up, most of them dressed in period uniforms. I don't know if you've ever been to a reenactment. My wife and I were at a couple of them. They can really be very frightening. They're very realistic. I think they get carried away. Different types of Confederate statues, types of statues and monuments. It's a very controversial subject right now, and I'm not going to get into any degree of politics. But I am going to say that not every statue or monument has a political intent, despite what you may have heard. Some were strictly to commemorate the boys who died from that town. Some are designed strictly to show, strictly to commemorate the boys who had died from that particular town. There's no political intent, while others, of course, do, or to maybe honor the military leaders. Now, those are the statues which people are trying to remove. But large members of the South, people in the South, were so appreciative of what the women had done, and many at their own expense, that they went north, they exhumed all the bodies of the Confederate sons and brought them back down south. They put up huge monuments of appreciation. Now, a lot of this would have been done by the Daughters of the Confederacy. And you see how huge these are, and the amount of money which went into them. This one's in Baltimore, and this one's in Montgomery. There's no way you can ever remove anything like this unless you blew it up. But I don't think they're going to be removed so fast. They're going to stay there. This one is in Little Rock, Arkansas. A lot of these monuments were put up by the units well after the war, 1885. If you get into the 1890s, 1900, and the early 1900s, the veterans now are starting to die off, and they want a memory of what they had done. These battles had been so horrific. There's so many casualties that they wanted some sort of a memory about what had happened over there. And they started a monument building. The United Daughters of the Confederacy, however, um, was a political movement. And it kept the memory of the Confederacy alive and promoted the Southern point of view with history books, archives, monuments, statues, and monuments to one of the dead Confederates. There was a frenzy of monument building. Some of these were political, and some of them were just simple monuments to say how many boys from wherever town they were from. And I speak to them every now and then and doing research. They were the ones who promoted the Lost Cause. That's another program I have, and that's a subject for another day. But basically, in one paragraph, the Lost Cause was created by the South in 1865 to say that they were the victims of Northern aggression, but they were the innocent ones, and that it was the North who started the war. Well, exactly the opposite is true. In my program, The Lost Cause, I show exactly how the South lied about it, that they were the villains, they were the ones who started the war. And if anybody was guilty, it was the plantation owners. They wanted the war in the worst way to maintain slavery so that they continue to grow tobacco and cotton and rice as inexpensively as they could. So these women were really part of the problem because an entire generation, actually several generations of Southern men and children were brought up to believe that they were the victims and the North were the guilty ones. Not true. Exactly the opposite. Revisionist history. Monuments are still being built as recently as 2008. This particular group, the Connecticut 29th Colored, built this beautiful monument in New Haven. And the names of all the men who were on it. There's federal cemeteries, in Arlington and Jefferson Barracks. Okay, the Confederate cemeteries are in Georgia, Vicksburg, okay, Petersburg, Virginia. 30,000 Confederates are buried here. A large number of soldiers also are buried in the cemeteries and the churches where the people, the sons, where these people had gone. This particular one it's kind of odd because it's got both the Confederate and the Union flag, an American flag. So I have to assume that the descendant, this particular soldier, had relatives, maybe relatives who fought on both sides. The Irish Brigade, the 69th Regimental Monument, which is still in existence today in Manhattan, I believe, they suffered horrendous casualties. By the end of the war, the ranks had been so decimated that they had to break up what was left of the 69th and distribute it and spread it among other units. Then they were reorganized again after the war was over. A lot of the veterans, they were all Irish. A lot of the Irish immigrants who had joined it felt angry after the war because they figured they had performed so well in battle that the Union generals consistently called on them to fight in very, very difficult, hard battles where the casualties only increased. There weren't that many of them left after the war was over. Okay. A word about the only Jewish military cemetery outside of Israel. This is a very sad story. Petersburg was a major defeat for Robert E. Lee. In 1864, he had to pull out, and Richmond had already fallen. There were 30 Jewish men who fought for the Confederacy who died there. They had a Confederate cemetery, but they wouldn't allow the Jewish men to be buried with the Christian ones. They didn't want them there, so they buried them outside the cemetery. This was considered disrespectful and disgraceful that these men had died for the cause and they weren't even allowed to be buried with their fellow Christian soldiers. So as a result, they were buried outside. The women of the synagogue, the Beth Chabad Synagogue, which is one of the oldest synagogues in the country, it's in Richmond, Virginia, their women went to the sites where these men were buried. They knew where they were buried. They had the bodies exhumed, and they brought them back to the cemetery that was in back of the cemetery. They brought them to the cemetery that was in back of the synagogue, and they have a separate section over them. When my wife and I visited the cemetery, there were little Confederate flags over there. Now you may say, why would they want to fight for such a horrible cause that supported cemetery? The people at that time didn't see it that way. These people had to live with everybody else. If everybody else's sons went off to the war, You had to go off to the war, or else you were looked upon as unpatriotic. That's the way it was felt. You and I may not agree with it now in 2021, but if you were alive in 1861 and all your friends and relatives went off, you'd have to do the same thing. You'd be under social pressure not to. Doesn't make it right, but that's the way it was. Hightstown, New Jersey is the town over where I live. I live here in West Windsor. And here are 4 Confederate cannons that were captured by the boys from Hightstown, 35 of whom died in action. Now think about this. Hightstown is Hightstown has a lot of developments now, but certainly in the 1860s, it was nothing but farm country. It was only farm country up to about 20 years ago, 25 years ago. 35 men died just from Hightstown alone. You can see the enormity, the totality of the casualties that this war produced. So they rest in peace now, the Union men of Lincoln and the rebel men of Lee. And the small flags show that they're not forgotten. And while we condemn the cause for which the Confederate soldiers died, we have to acknowledge that soldiers died for the mistakes of their leaders and the misjudgments of the people they served. And 750,000 dead Americans bear witness to that. I'd like to close this program with some very well-known words. From these honest dead, we take increased devotion to that cause to which they gave the last full measure of devotion. President Abraham Lincoln, November 1863. Well, that concludes my program. I'd be glad to take any questions. I can see you. Can you see me?
Yep, we can see you just fine. Don't see any questions so far.
Marty?
Marty, I have a question.
Yes, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Was it Maryland?
Marty?
Yes.
Yes. Where were the wives buried when, if their husbands were buried near their hometown, say, were the wives buried next to their husbands? If they knew who they were?
No, to my knowledge, most of them were not buried because they buried them individually. And maybe later on, after the Civil War, maybe the custom changed, but to my knowledge, they weren't. But I could be wrong in that thing. I think in some cases, the wives are buried under the husbands, or on top of the husbands. I think maybe that's the way it would have been done. But normally, to my knowledge, these are individual graves. That is a good question, though.
Thank you.
Anybody else have a question?
Marty, I was wondering, I heard that there were women fighters during the Civil War that joined the Army. Is that true or not?
Approximately 450 to 750 women served in combat. And the way they did that was they had to disguise their sex. They dressed as men. They smoked, they drank, they did everything, played cards. They had to pretend they were men, and most of them got away with it. If they were discovered, then they'd be cashiered out. They were given their pay. They'd be sent home. It wasn't unusual for women to join up with their husbands and dress as men because they wanted to be together with them. At Gettysburg, on July 5th or 6th, after the Confederates had left it, when Lee returned to Virginia, the Union Army was cleaning up all the dead Southern bodies. They found one woman in a Confederate uniform, dressed as she was swore as a man. She was killed in action. So yes, there were women who volunteered to fight, and generally they got their pensions, but they weren't. It wasn't like in today's times where they're encouraged to join the military. A lot of women, of course, volunteered for the civilian forces and the aid societies. A large number of them were involved as nurses, and some of them went into the battlefield. But the women, there were a number of women who fought. And by the way, these women were considered to be heroes to the feminist groups. women had been very active in the abolitionist cause before the war, and they after the war, a lot of them became speakers. They traveled around the country, many of them for the feminist movements, and they gave speeches about their experiences. A lot of them wrote books. At the beginning of the war, they were kind of looked down upon. They were referred to as lesbians and insane, and to do something like that, what woman would want to go to war? But later generations appreciated the sacrifice they had made and the fact that they supported it, and that there were good role models for women who getting involved with the feminist movement. So there was, as I said, they wrote books, they gave speeches, and they were, I think later on they were held in very high regard, but certainly not at the time they did it.
We have one question from the chat that says, do you know the sad tale of Sergeant Amos?
No, I do not. What's his name again?
Amos Humiston? Do you know this tale of his death?
No, I'm not familiar with him. Who was he?
Let's see if there's any confirmation for any further information from the.
I can chat if you allow me to.
Sure.
Please do.
Thank you. My name is Chris. Amos Humiston was died as an unknown soldier in Gettysburg in a national campaign through a Philadelphia newspaper went up to identify the body, and eventually he was identified as a soldier from one of the New York regiments who had died on a side street in Gettysburg. But there was a whole campaign that happened as the only unknown soldier, and some Philadelphia reporter picked it up and advertised it as widely as possible. But the sort of aftermath of that was that the wife identified through a photo of the children that was found on the body and published in the newspaper, and then she became she became the headmistress of a orphanage in Gettysburg for orphan children because of the war. But that ended in scandal also. It's a really interesting story. There is a monument in Gettysburg on a side street to Amos Humiston, the only individual monument to an individual soldier in Gettysburg.
I'm not familiar with the gentleman. Keep in mind that there were so many heroes at Gettysburg. It's really hard to keep track of all of them. And I mentioned at the cemetery, there's 3,500 men buried at Gettysburg National Cemetery, but there's also an additional something like 960 unknown soldiers. They don't know what side they were on or who they were, because some of these bodies were just destroyed. They were hit with canister on the third day at Pickett's charge, as the Confederates, Pickett's men, Pettigrew's men, as they approached the Union lines, the Union was shooting canister at them, which basically is a monster shotgun. It literally blew them to pieces. So all they had was pieces of uniforms. It was horrible, pieces of men. So there's over as mentioned, there's over 900 bodies buried at that cemetery, totally unidentified. They have no idea what side they were on, but they were anyway. So it's hard to keep track of just about everybody. I wasn't aware of that particular statue, but then again, I've been to Gettysburg many, many times with my son, and I never saw the statue of Elizabeth Thorne. I read about that in doing research for the program.
Okay, we've got another one. Could you talk a little bit more about the Jewish graves and Jewish servicemen? I'm curious if any Jewish service women. You briefly mentioned the separation of burials. Could you expand a little on this?
Well, there were a number of very remarkable Jewish women on the Confederate side. There were two sisters, Phoebe Levy and a sister whose name I forget. One of them ran a very large Confederate soldiers' hospital, and another one was a spy. She got caught and she went to jail for a few months. She got sent home. This woman was a spy. At the same time, she was raising 9 children. Now you figure out how any woman can do that. But nevertheless, some of them wrote books. After the war, they gave speeches. Look, wherever you live, you're expected to serve the cause of the people you live in. If not, then you have to leave the area. Jews were under pressure at that time. They were a very, very tiny minority. There was a lot of anti-Semitism in the South. I'm not making excuses for them, don't misunderstand. But these people are under social pressure. And if you lived in Savannah, or if you lived in any place else, or Augusta, Georgia, where maybe there's only 50 families like yourself, Jewish families, you have to go along with everybody is doing. You may think they have to be brave and say no. It's not as simple as that, right? And I'm not apologizing for everyone. I'm just saying that sometimes you're under pressure to do certain things because you have to follow the culture of the place where you live. You live there, you work there, you know these people. Your own family may be intermarried with them. What are you supposed to do? So this is what happened. It may not be right. I know in today's times, there's probably a hell of a lot of people who disagree with me, but that's pretty much they were. They were under social pressure. So I don't know of any Jewish women that are actually found in the army. There may have been some, but they're not known to us today because a lot of them kept it secret. Any woman who fought as a man in the Civil War, for the most part, kept it quiet. Only a few of them surfaced after the war and came out and said this is what they had done. And the ones who were eloquent and were able to write well, they were the ones who wrote books, and they were the ones who gave speeches. But that was later on. It was in the 1880s and 90s was when they were going around doing that kind of work.
Thank you so much. I know you touched upon the burial. Is there any distinction in any of the burial areas in Mercer County of Jewish servicemen, or or they were just buried separately in Jewish graveyards?
In the Union side, since it was done by the federal government, all soldiers would have been buried in the same cemetery, with the exception of African American soldiers being put in a segregated part of the cemetery. But Jewish soldiers would have been buried with Christian ones. There wouldn't have been a distinction, at least to my knowledge. But I didn't see any reference to that. The only reference I saw was to black soldiers being buried separately in the cemetery. Now down south, the only reference I came across to Jewish soldiers being buried outside a Confederate cemetery was the one at Petersburg, and that's the reason why the women of that particular synagogue went. They exhumed the bodies and brought them back to Richmond. But that was a disgrace to do that, even though they were on the wrong side of the issue, the wrong side of history.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Well, thank you so much for attending. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for everyone for coming. Martin, thank you for once again a very interesting and enlightening presentation.
You're very welcome. It was a pleasure.
Okay. Thanks again. Good night, everyone.
Good night.